I just realized I went through all of that and I was not recording at all. Grab the stupid towel. We're gonna do the intro again. Be happy. Be happy. Everything's fine. Good morning.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Let's do it. Good morning, evening, or afternoon, whichever one currently applies to you at this point in time. I like customer states videos because they're endlessly enjoyable and they really tell you how bad people neglect their cars. However, that's not what happened to me recently. Somebody approached me and said, hey, can you take a look at my car? I've got a check engine light. And I was so happy because most people just grab a piece of tape, stick it down and pretend it's not there until their car literally bursts into flames or just stops working. So, thank you. Now, upon scanning the vehicle, I found that they have a P0303 as well as a P0444. For those of you who are unfamiliar with diagnostic trouble codes, or DTCs, that is what your car's computer saves when something's wrong. And that basically gives information to the mechanic or the technician who's going to be addressing what is wrong. Now, for the P0300s, that is for cylinder misfires, and for the P0400 codes, those are for evap and emission issues. So, the first thing we're going to do is address that misfire because that can lead to damage to your cylinders or your firing chambers if they're not addressed correctly. So let's start with the ignition system. And yes, that is an almighty spark plug. The first thing you're going to do is make sure that the spark plug in that cylinder is okay. Now really quick, a P0303, that last number will tell you what cylinder that misfire is going on in. So if you have a P0301, that's for cylinder 1. If it's for cylinder 2, it'll be a 302, and so on. If you've got a V6, it could be up to 6. A V8 will be up to 8. If you're driving a school bus or a dump truck or something that's really big, it could be up to 12. So act accordingly and take a look at that last number. For the vehicle that I'm talking about, it was a 303, so the first thing I did was pull out the spark plug that was in cylinder 3, as well as the ignition coil that was in ignition 3. I found that replacing the spark plugs with new ones did not fix the issue, unfortunately. I also found that swapping the ignition coil didn't really move the cylinder misfire, so I was like, okay, well, the cylinder's got to be good, and these spark plugs were changed not too long ago by me, so what do I do? And the issue was that it was such a small misfire. Now, fortunately, what you can do is a little trick. Instead of just replacing all of them and charging your customer $400 plus whatever your labor is to move that ignition coil. And if you want to be a little more technical, you could do them one at a time, because if you move the ignition coil and the spark plug at the same time to another cylinder, you'll get a misfire on that cylinder. However, you still won't know whether it's the ignition coil or whether it's the spark plug. So since it's easier to quickly do this, pull out the ignition coil, since you don't have to remove the spark plug, and put it in cylinder 1, cylinder 2, cylinder 4, cylinder anything else. And if you see that when you scan that code again, you see the misfire happening in that other cylinder, then you know it's your ignition coil. If everything's still okay and you take out the spark plug and swap it to another spot, then you know that your spark plug is the issue. Last case scenario, you change both and nothing happens. It could be either something wrong with the wiring harness or the distributor cap, or unfortunately it could be something wrong with the computer or the cylinder itself. The piston, it could be oil blow by. There could be several reasons why you could be getting a misfire. It could also be inside your valve cover, that the seals that keep oil away from the spark plug could be leaking into the spark plug. So check for any signs of oil either on the threads, on the body, because sometimes the blow-by will actually get oil past it'll get it onto the actual body. You don't want anything except electricity passing through this. This should not be wet, this should not be near oil, coolant, this should be dry. You want to make sure you check the pins. You're going to look for any signs of bending, corrosion. You get like a greenish, bluish color. Something's wrong with that particular pin. You might have 4 pins, 5 pins, 3 pins, whatever your connection, make sure that they're all good. You're also going to check in there and make sure that there's not dust, powder, debris, water. If you're in the middle of winter, check for frost. You want to make sure this is okay. Also give it a little bit of a shake. If you hear a rattling, it could be that the fuse inside broke. Sometimes you can change them. Other times it's better to just fully replace the unit. Fortunately for me and for the I was going to say patient. Wow, my medical brain just kicked in. Plus, a stethoscope is here. Nope, no patients, right? These don't go in people. Fortunately for me, all she needed was the ignition coil repaired. So all you're going to need for that to remove your ignition coil is a 10mm socket. Again, your bolts might be a little bit different, but generally speaking, a lot of manufacturers use 10mm. So you're just going to loosen up the ignition coil, unclick the connector, and this pops out. You pop it in. The hardest part about this procedure is paying over $100 for a quality part. That's the hardest part. It's honestly being able to afford it. So once she has a new ignition coil, she has already reported that her car is driving better. I have already since ordered the next 3, and I will be putting those on for her in the near future. As for changing the spark plugs, I also replaced all 4 with a pack of fresh ones. But for the spark plug, you're going to need simply a replacement spark plug, your extension that's going to go down into the spark plug well to be able to pull it off. You're going to need some kind of magnet so that once it's loose, you can retrieve it with a magnet. I personally like this quantum pen light from Harbor Freight because it's a flashlight. It's a really bright work light. It has a UV light, and the bottom is a magnet. So that right there, I love it. I can just stick it up and then place that magnet right back on the hood, and it can also be my light. That being said, you will also need a deep well socket for your actual spark plug to remove it. Keep in mind that this one's a 14, but you might replace it with something that now comes with a 15 pitch. So keep in mind, you might have a socket to remove it, but you will also need the size to then tighten down the replacement. So don't buy a 14 socket only, try to get a set. That way, if you need to move up or move down, you're not, up the creek without a paddle, so to speak. Now that we've solved our issues with the Misfire, we're going to start correcting that P0444. Before we go throwing new wires and starting to solder things and potentially barbecuing something under the hood that's important or really expensive, we're going to take a look at the 3 important valves that make the evap system work. For those of you who are unfamiliar, all it does is moves vapors from your gas tank, traps it into the evap canister or vapor canister or charcoal canister. In Nissan, they call it a vapor canister, so that's what I'm going to be calling it from here forward. When your vapor canister collects through the activated charcoal that is inside of it, collects those vapors, a vacuum line then moves it through some of the purge valves to your intake manifold, and that's where they become burned again for 2 reasons. 1, it helps with fuel economy, and 2, it also helps with the planet and emissions and keeping the least amount of pollution in the air. All right, so we've got a crude Microsoft Paint drawing of the evap system as far as the 2 solenoids that are mentioned in this evap system and how they're going to be used when they're working properly, just so that you have an understanding of what the heck I'm talking about. So right here, I've got the G for gas. This is your gas tank. If you have petrol or if you got some diesel, I'm not talking about you right now. Everything is the same. Just assume this is fuel, okay? So from your gas tank, you're going to have a fuel line that's going to go to your vent canister. That's what VC is here. That VC, or vent canister, is going to have an opening and a nipple. That opening is going to be for your vent canister solenoid. There's going to be an O-ring here, so it's going to be a press fit, and there's going to be a small plastic, just something to clip it onto, and you're going to have a nipple with the vent that goes out to atmosphere. This is just a bit of air that is going to be taken by the vent canister because the rest of it is going to be pulled on by vacuum. So you can't have this thing pulled on by vacuum in a sealed setting because it would start cracking inward like a Coke bottle or some kind of plastic bottle that you would suck on. Since there's not equalized pressure on the outside and inside, it would start to crinkle inward. So This is for the sake of equalizing pressure. It'll probably be fed somewhere into your subframe or a cross member under your car, and it's just taking in outside air. Inside here, you're going to have an activated carbon that's going to be pulling from the vapors that are inside your gas tank. These vapors are moved into here, stored into the charcoal, and then are slowly purged out through a vacuum line here that your solenoid here is going to allow in. Your solenoid is going to receive power, and that's what's going to close it when the purging is happening over here, just so that there's not too much going on at once. Your computer's in charge of how much vapor is pulled and stopped, so everything is at the right ratio. You need to make sure that the O-ring is carefully seated, everything is working, and the electrical is going well. If that's good, then the ECU will have no problem with this circuit, and we can keep moving forward. As we go up this vacuum line, I just drew this red line so you know that this is where the firewall starts, or where the firewall is, and you're going to keep going up the vacuum line up to the purge control valve. Now this control valve is again powered by the ECU. This is always closed, and when it's given power, it opens up, allowing those purged vapors to move into the intake manifold, which is I here, into your engine, which is E. If this is not working or this is not working, you will have some type of evap code. Now with a P0444, it's an issue with the circuit somewhere here, or it could be an issue between your ECU and, for Nissan Rogues, your IPDM, which is your smart module, and that will make sure that it's basically like a personal assistant for your ECU. And that basically tells your fuel injectors, your air conditioner, your immobilizer, anti-theft, all the things that are smart, quote unquote, for your car, so that the ECU can focus on the problems and making sure that ratios are okay. The IPDM is going to be doing all the scut work. Now with all that, I hope you're not too confused. This is just a bare bones understanding. So no more stalling, let's get some hands-on experience, shall we? Follow me. So here we have our three main culprits. More these two because of their electrical components, because it is a 444 circuit issue. However, we never want to forget about the little one that's usually forgotten about. So I'm going to go in order of which is easiest to change to the one that's probably the most difficult to get to. And keep in mind, they're all equally important and they should all be working in your car or truck or van, whatever you got. So to be clear, as you can see, I did use an aftermarket part for the vehicle at the request of the owner. She wanted the most affordable option, so I gave it to her. And the replacement cost about $7 to $8. This is the original one from her Nissan, and this was 14 years, busting its butt, doing a great job. Rest in peace, little buddy. I'm going to show you why that failed in a second, but if you have the expendable income, do go for the OEM parts. Order it from your dealership. Try to get it locally or have it shipped to your house. It'll last a lot longer. They're usually made of higher quality. However, since this is something that is, mainly plastic, the biggest thing you have to worry about is just the one-way valve that's inside. So we're about to see what happens in a good one and a bad one. Do have to give you a slight warning though, if you have pliers that have really harsh teeth, as you can see from the scraping up on the side, they do chew these up because these are fully plastic. Use them at your own risk, otherwise a socket is your best way to go. You're going to look at four things. You're going to look at the threads to make sure they're okay, and if they are, you are going to move up to the O-ring, and you're going to make sure that it's not brittle. If you have a pick, you can take the pick and pull it off and put on another one if you see that it's broken or frayed or breaking. Next, you're going to look at the nipple, make sure there's no holes or fractures in the side, anything that would damage the integrity, because this can snap off inside the hose. And finally, you're going to look at the valve inside, which is the most important part. This is a one-way valve. Sometimes carbon and oil residue can stick inside it and cause it to fail in the open or closed position. So you're going to blow on this thing. Don't blow on it as soon as you pull it out of the car because it's covered in oil and it's dirty. You can use brake cleaner or any kind of carb choke cleaner. Make sure it's completely dry, completely clean. I'll take my risk and just blow on it. So really quick, when this thing is in a one-way valve, it's going to be pulling air, vapors from here, and the vacuum is going to be pulling it upward toward the intake manifold. So pretend I'm the crankcase or the engine. I'm going to be getting air sucked out of me up into the intake. So I'm going to be blowing forward. And I can feel a little bit of resistance and stutter when it does it. I've cleaned this thing several times with several different methods, and the valve is just sticking. Forward and back, you can't really hear anything. Side to side, you can kind of hear the valve moving a little bit, but ultimately, when you blow from the top, it should lock. And I can feel a leak coming from this valve. That tells me that the valve has failed. And so, rightfully so, I replaced it. This isn't taking advantage of somebody by just giving them unnecessary crap. And if you can do something that they won't have to worry about for another X amount of years, then do it. With their consent, of course. And the final way you can tell if this is failing as far as the valve goes is if you check the vacuum hose where this is pulling from. If you stick the tip of a paper towel, do not put Q-tips or anything with a bunch of lint because that can get sucked up into the air intake. But if you can take a shop towel or anything that's robust, a microfiber towel, if you wipe inside of it and there's oil, it means that the valve is not just allowing vapors, but it's allowing free-flowing oil into there. And you don't want that to be building up because it can cause issues with intake, hot spots, and combustion. We don't want that. Be on the lookout for those. And if anything that I said is bad, then you got to replace it. So if the threads are bad, replace it. If the O-ring is bad, just replace the O-ring. If this head is completely chewed up as far as the sides, replace it. And if something's wrong with the nipple, replace it. The next thing we have is the purge control valve or the purge control solenoid, and that is going to be essentially what the code actually was calling for. However, sometimes this one, the computer can confuse it with the vent canister solenoid, so be sure to check them both. Now this one actually has an electronic connector. You can see that. There's a 2-pin, and with these you're going to have 2 nipples instead of 1 like the PCV valve had, and it's going to be 1 for intake, which is going to be pulling from the vent canister solenoid, which is connected to the Evap, and this one is going to be flowing up into the intake manifold to be burned. You want to make sure that the fuel vapors are being burned, again, for fuel economy as well as emission and pollution. So as you can see, this one is very beat up, very worn. It's done its job for 14 years, and even if mechanically it's working, electronically it might not all be there. So again, like the PCV valve, I'm going to blow on this one. When this is not receiving any power, it's stuck in the closed position. So if I blow, you hear absolutely no leak, which means mechanically this thing's okay. There's no sign of any broken coil. It's completely silent, which tells me physically it's okay. However, that electrical connection may tell a different story. So I'm going to show you how you test it with a battery. In a second, I'm going to put my microphone down right next to it so you can hear the solenoid engaging and disengaging once it's given power and taken away. But I want to show you first how you would actually set it up. So all you would need is a 9-volt battery and 2 alligator clips. Try to find very small ones because the connectors inside of this solenoid are very small. Now these have the rubber insulation, so try to find ones that have these little rubber sleeves, because the last thing you want is for these things to touch. You want to make sure, and there's not a lot of clearance in there, so you have to be very careful about making sure that each of these connectors are properly seated without touching the other. Because if it causes an arc, you can actually damage the piece or damage your battery. Really quick, if you happen to be looking for these alligator clips, you can find them in a pack of 10. I mean, you can find them anywhere, but I got these at Harbor Freight. You get 10 of the leads, low voltage, and when they say low voltage, It is 28 gauge wire, so don't go running, you know, super high voltages through this. However, it can hold up to 300 volts if that's something you're interested in. Otherwise, they do have other ones that are slightly bigger, but I like the small teeth on these because those leads are really tough to get to, very tiny. So let's get started. The first thing you're going to do is take one of your alligator clips and you're going to clip it onto one of the pins. You're going to be very careful that your alligator clip is fully secure, fully seated, that it's not going to swing back and forth because you don't want it arcing against the other pin. So make sure that if you have to, you can take it out, reset it, set it back. Make sure it's as far to the far wall as possible, because when you introduce your next pin clip, you're going to make sure they're not touching. So if possible, pull both sleeves back and look down and make sure that neither of them is touching. Once you have that, you're going to carefully set that down, and then you're going to take your battery and you're going to hook up first, and be very clear, you're going to hook up the negative terminal first. Okay? Now nothing's going to happen yet because you haven't touched your hot side. So this is the perfect time, once again, to check and make sure that your leads are not touching, that your alligator clips are not swaying, touching, that the pins are not bending toward each other, because the last thing you want is a nasty spark or a short, and you've got a fluffy blanket, for example, right under. Now I'm going to put my microphone down so you can listen. So despite the fact that that might sound really good for you because I did have the microphone very close to it, it's a very weak connection that it's giving off. But again, without knowing 100% for sure, we would have to replace this. Now, the OEM ones can run to $300, and that's not really something that the owner wanted to go for. So I completely understood, and I decided to go with aftermarket for this one. Unfortunately, after replacing both the PCB and this one, the code persisted. So the last step was the vent canister solenoid. I know that mechanically it's okay. Electrically, it feels like it's really lacking, but I don't think this was quite the issue. I think it was contributing to it though, because as soon as I changed this and the other vent, it changed from a 444 to a 443. So once our code goes from 444 to 443, we know we're on the right track because things are starting to change. So could it be that the open, which is what a 443 indicates, the purge control valve circuit open, it could be in the electronics within this solenoid that are causing it to not relay back to the ECU properly, or PCU or ECM or ECU. Like, it's essentially the car's computer. Manufacturers might have different names. They are interchangeable, however. So if the electronics here are not sending the signal back, it could show the open there. Otherwise, it's possible that a squirrel or a mouse or a rat or something decided to chew through one of the wires, and then we'd have to start pulling wire harnesses apart. And that could be one, labor intensive, which means time consuming, and which means money intensive. So the solenoid seems to be engaging. It's actually much louder than the purge control valve at the top. And when you blow through this while it has a power connection, you should not be able to blow air through it, which it is not. However, in the resting position, it should tightly be open so that any and all vapor can get in through here from the canister, and then it can be pulled through the nipple through into the intake manifold at the top. So when you listen, you can hear the valve in there is loose. Now, as far as the spring looks to be worn, if you can see those cracks in the coil. So I went out and changed this one. So she now has a new PCB, a new purge control valve, and a new vent canister valve, which were the main fixes potentially for the circuit before actually having to pull wire harnesses apart, because that is the most labor intensive and the most costly thing. I wanted to make sure we go through the basic things first to avoid bringing up that cost for her. Now, because my conscience runs too deep, even after changing her spark plugs, changing her ignition coils, changing the 3 valves, I still felt bad because the issue was still persisting. I feel horrible charging somebody for an issue that I couldn't fully fix. So I let her know, don't worry about it. All you have to do is just pay for the parts. Don't worry about labor. This was a learning experience for me and something that I could put on YouTube to help anybody who may be needing to test those particular parts for failure. Now, as far as the shop that she went to, which again, when you're dealing with electrical issues, they can basically charge whatever they want because a lot of people, especially in certain parts, don't touch electrical at all, just like there's shops that don't touch transmissions at all. It's just really labor intensive, and some shops just don't want to do it. Other shops, they know that everybody else needs it, so they kind of put that niche, and wherever they set up, they can charge, you know, whatever they like. So I knew that for whatever reason, power wasn't being sent from the purge control valve, because as soon as I changed it to a new piece, it did change codes, which tells me that something is, you know, improving. However, it wasn't changing voltage the way it was supposed to. So the shop that she decided to take it to did in fact charge her $1,600 out the door, which is kind of rough. And what they did was they sensed a Evap purge malfunction. They checked everything. They traced it back to the ECM and the IPDM. For those of you who don't know what an IPDM, that's your Intelligent Power Distribution Module. You know, very common that it goes bad with Nissan Rogues. Anything from like 2018 back, usually something's going to pop up at some point. But what they did was they checked the connections, repaired all the connections because apparently there might have been some corrosions or some breakages. Not entirely sure. I'm just going off of what the technician's notes. And they performed a smoke test to make sure that there were no issues with the vacuum lines. Thankfully, those were good. And they did a test drive as well as a status and readiness. And then they went and they took it for an emission for her, and it passed. So that was nice of them to do as well. So all in all, again, you have to know when to fold. Which means if you don't know what you're doing as far as electrical, don't just go yanking wires and saying, well, these are touching now, these are touching, is the light off? You don't want to go frying your expensive computer if your computer's okay. In this particular case, Nissan tried to get me to pay $4,000 to start for a computer that it didn't need. And it turns out all it needed was proper rewiring. So the way I let the owner know was you were going to pay possibly about $5,000 to Nissan for something you didn't need versus $1,600, which is what she paid, to have the issue properly fixed. And not only that, they were also nice enough to take it to an emission test. Now, she thought her emissions was for next March, and in fact, it was for August. She would have been not street legal in the state that we live in, and that would mean she would have to park her vehicle and not be able to use it until it was, you know, properly fixed. So she would have been dealing with this problem now, or she would have been parked and dealing with it next year. So definitely take care of your cars as soon as possible. Urge the people that you're working for. Let them know, hey, this is important. Hey, this can wait. Prioritize it by how serious it is to how, you know, optional it can be. So in closing, for those of you who are unsure, P0444s, if it's electrical and you've taken all the variables, which are all the valves that have electrical components, if that's out and you don't see any stray wires, anything hanging, try your ignition system. Sometimes wonky systems can happen, especially in the case with Nissan Rogues, because the same wiring harness that the cable for the purge control valve is wired to is the same harness that the ignition coils run through. So sometimes if those wires are frayed or touched or corroded, and they're in the same wire harness, if there's an open somewhere, there's a chance that they could start rubbing up against each other and create an open. Now hope that it's an open and not a short, because if it's a short, you can end up causing some serious damage and potentially even a fire under your hood. Stay safe out there. And until next time, besides paying whatever money that you gotta pay, work smarter.